February 24, 1991. 400 hours. The trackless, shifting interior of the Saudi-Iraqi border. The air was a freezing cocktail of fine grit and diesel exhaust, whipped into a violent frenzy by a Shamal wind that had erased the horizon long before the first turbine engine turned over. Below the treads of the heavy armor, the sand was neither solid nor predictable. It was a deceptive slurry of limestone dust and ancient silt. Inside the steel belly of the M1A1 Abrams, the only light came from the sickly green phosphor of the thermal sights and the steady, rhythmic pulse of a small boxy unit bolted hastily to the commander's dash, a device that, according to the official manifests, wasn't even supposed to be fully operational yet.
Captain H.R.
McMaster, commander of Eagle Troop, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, adjusted his CVC helmet and squinted through the dust-streaked periscope. He looked out into a void where God had forgotten to put landmarks, a place where professional navigators went to die. There were no roads here. There were no ridgelines, no trees. And certainly no visual references to tell a man if he was heading toward his objective or wandering aimlessly into a lethal desert trap. In any other era of human history, moving 1,000 tanks through this sea of nothing at night would have been considered a suicide mission. The Iraqi High Command felt safe here. To them, the desert was not a battlefield, it was a fortress. They had studied the history of desert warfare, from the legendary maneuvers of Rommel to the ancestral knowledge of the Bedouin tribes. And they knew the iron law of the sand: you cannot navigate what you cannot see, and you cannot fight what you cannot find. Saddam's generals believed the vast, featureless expanse of the Iraqi western flank was a wall of dust that would swallow any Western army whole. They expected the Americans to stick to the highways and the well-mapped coastal routes. They banked their entire defensive strategy on the belief that the empty quarter was an impassable barrier for a modern, mechanized force.
They were wrong.
They were operating on a map of the earth. The Americans were operating on a map of the heavens. What the Iraqi generals didn't know, what the world was about to witness, was that the United States had spent a decade quietly rewriting the very definition of place and time. They hadn't just brought more tanks and better guns. They had brought a system that turned the stars themselves into a digital grid of absolute certainty. You see, most people think of a tank as a weapon of steel and fire. But on this night, the most lethal component of the Abrams wasn't its 120mm smoothbore gun. It was the signal it was receiving from 12,000 miles above the Earth's surface. As McMaster's troops surged forward, the sand began to scream against the hulls of the 68-ton monsters. The visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. To any onlooker, it would have looked like blind chaos. But inside the lead tanks, the commanders weren't looking at the dust. They were looking at the screens. They were watching a tiny cursor crawl across a digital void with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. For the first time in the history of human conflict, the fog of war was being burned away by a constellation of silicon and gold. The Iraqis had dug their T-72s into deep berms, pointing their barrels toward the south, confident that no one could possibly find them from the west. They sat in the dark, listening to the wind, waiting for an enemy that they believed was hundreds of miles away. Stuck in the mud of the coast or lost in the sandstorms of the border. They didn't know that the 2nd ACR was currently cutting through the impassable desert at 25 miles per hour. Moving with the terrifying confidence of a predator that could see through the curve of the earth itself. What they did not know, what the world was about to discover, is that you cannot build a wall against something that was designed, from its very first blueprint, to make walls irrelevant. The American military wasn't just invading a country, they were debuting a new era of human existence. The moment the first Abrams crossed that invisible line in the sand, the era of guessing was over. The era of the global positioning system had arrived. And it was about to turn the largest tank army in the Middle East into a collection of stationary targets. And just like that, the equation of modern warfare was permanently rewritten. To understand why the Iraqi generals were so confident in their desert shield, you have to understand the ancient, brutal history of land navigation. For 5,000 years, the desert was the great equalizer of empires. From the legions of Rome to the British long-range desert group in World War II, the sand had a way of humbling even the most sophisticated armies. You see, most people think navigating is about looking at a map. But in the desert, a map is a lie.
The dunes move.
The wind erases the tracks of those who came before you. The heat creates mirages that lure men toward water that isn't there. And the night hides the drop-offs that can swallow a reconnaissance vehicle whole. In 1942, Erwin Rommel, the legendary desert fox, once remarked that in the desert, the bravest man is often at the mercy of the man with the best compass. But even the best compass was a crude tool when you were trying to coordinate the movement of 50,000 men across 1,000 square miles of
nothing.
If you were off by just 2 degrees at the start of your journey, you would be miles away from your objective by sunrise. In the high-stakes world of mechanized warfare, being off by a little meant you weren't reinforcing your flank. It meant you were driving into an ambush. The American military had known this since the 1970s. As the Cold War intensified, the Pentagon realized that if they ever had to fight the Soviet Union on the vast plains of Europe or the rolling hills of the Middle East, the side that could move fastest and most accurately would win. But the solution they proposed was so radical, so expensive, and so theoretically complex that many in the upper echelons of the Department of Defense thought it was a scientist's toy rather than a weapon of
Va. They called it Navstar.
But we know it as GPS. At the heart of this toy was a man named Dr. Bradford Parkinson, an Air Force colonel with a vision that sounded like science fiction to the boots-on-the-ground generals of the post-Vietnam era. Parkinson was an engineer who understood a fundamental truth that many had forgotten: if you want to know exactly where you are on the ground, you have to stop looking at the ground. You have to look at the stars. But the stars we see in the sky are too far away and too slow to move. Parkinson didn't want to use the stars God gave us, he wanted to build his own. The skepticism was thick enough to choke on. During the late 70s and early 80s, the GPS program was nearly cancelled more than a dozen times. Conservative planners argued that the system was too fragile. "You're telling me," one skeptic famously asked, "that a tank commander in the middle of a battle is going to rely on a signal coming from a piece of tin foil floating in vacuum?" They mocked the idea of a space clock. They preferred the tried-and-true methods: paper maps, grease pencils, and the magnetic pull of a needle. They didn't realize that in the 20th century, those tools were like bringing a knife to a nuclear standoff. You see, the problem Parkinson was trying to solve wasn't just about direction. It was about time. This is the teaching pause the world missed. GPS doesn't actually measure distance. It measures the time it takes for a radio signal to travel from a satellite to a receiver at the speed of light. To do that, you need an atomic clock so precise that it only loses 1 second every 30 million years. The DoD bean counters looked at the price tag of those clocks and laughed. They saw a solution in search of a problem. But the problem was coming. It was buried in the sands of Kuwait and Iraq, where a dictator named Saddam Hussein was building the 4th largest army on the planet. Saddam had spent billions on French-made radars, Soviet-built tanks, and a massive network of bunkers. He believed he had the tactical advantage because he owned the landscape. He knew the desert. He believed that if he could just force the Americans to fight on his terms, in the blinding dust and the trackless interior, their technological edge would vanish. He thought American soldiers, raised in the suburbs and trained on paved roads, would crumble the moment they lost sight of their own supply lines. The truth was that while the Iraqis were mastering the terrain, the Americans were mastering the data. By 1990, the GPS constellation was still incomplete. Only 16 satellites were in orbit. And the commercial receivers were so rare that soldiers' families were literally buying them at electronic stores like Radio Shack and mailing them to the front lines in care packages. The skeptics were still calling it an experimental system. They didn't think it was ready for prime time. But General Norman Schwarzkopf and his planners saw something the skeptics didn't. They saw a way to do the one thing the Iraqis thought was impossible: the left hook. To pull it off, they had to move a massive armored fist hundreds of miles into the deep desert, far away from any road, and hit the Iraqi Republican Guard from behind. It was a maneuver that required absolute, pinpoint synchronization. If one division got lost, the entire coalition could be cut to pieces. The weight of the world was resting on Dr. Parkinson's experimental clocks. They were about to find out if you could really navigate the modern world by listening to the whispers of man-made stars.
Thought for ones.
Section 4, First Deployment/Enemies Realization. Previous_section_text. Continues seamlessly from where this left off. February 26, 1991. 1,600 hours. The left hook was no longer a plan on a map. It was a wall of steel, 9 divisions wide, screaming through the black heart of a Shamal sandstorm. The weather was a nightmare, a thick, churning soup of wet sand and freezing rain that reduced visibility to a few meters. For any other army in history, this would have been the moment the offensive ground to a halt. You couldn't see the tank in front of you, let alone the enemy.
But for Captain H.R.
McMaster and the men of Eagle Troop, the world was as clear as a sunny day in Kansas. In the turret of his M1A1 Abrams, McMaster wasn't fighting the weather. He was fighting the grid. The slugger receiver gave him his exact position relative to a north-south line of longitude known as 73 easting. This wasn't a road or a river, it was an invisible mathematical construct. A line in the digital sand where the mission shifted from movement to contact. The Iraqi Republican Guard's Tawakalna division was dug in just beyond that line. They were the elite, Saddam's best, and they had spent months fortifying their positions. They were sitting behind massive sand berms, their T-72 barrels pointed toward the southwest, waiting for the Americans to come up the traditional routes. What the Iraqi commanders didn't understand, and what they were about to realize in the most violent way possible, was that the Americans weren't coming
from the south.
They were coming from the void. You see, the Iraqis had committed the fatal sin of underestimation. They assumed that if they couldn't see through the sandstorm, the Americans couldn't either. They believed that no army would be foolish enough to move at full speed through a trackless desert in the middle of a gale. They expected the Americans to be huddled in their vehicles, lost and confused, waiting for the weather to break. But the Americans weren't looking for landmarks. They were chasing a cursor on a screen. Every tank in Eagle Troop was synchronized to the same nanosecond, guided by the same man-made stars. Suddenly, out of the swirling brown haze, the Iraqi bunkers appeared, not as silhouettes, but as heat signatures on the thermal sights. The Abrams didn't slow down. They didn't stop to range the targets. They simply opened fire. It was a slaughter at a distance. The 120mm depleted uranium rounds punched through the Iraqi armor before the Iraqi crews even knew there was an enemy in the area. One captured Iraqi officer later told his interrogators that he thought the Americans were using some kind of magic or ghost technology. He had been sitting in his command bunker, listening to the wind, when his entire front line simply began to explode. There were no engine noises, no visual cues, just a rhythmic sequence of detonations that moved with terrifying precision from one T-72 to the next. He looked out through his periscope into the sandstorm and saw nothing. No tanks, no infantry, just a wall of dust. He couldn't understand how an enemy could hit a target they couldn't see, from a direction they weren't supposed to be in. The truth was even more terrifying than magic. It was math. What the enemy realized in that moment, the moment their tanks were being toasted in their berms, was that the protector had become the betrayer. The very desert they had relied on to hide them was now acting as a cloak for the Americans. Because of GPS, the U.S. armor didn't need a clear day or a paved road. They could navigate a featureless void with the same accuracy as a surveyor on a city street. They were using the curvature of the earth to lob shells from beyond the horizon, guided by coordinates that the Iraqis didn't even know existed. The mini-revelation for the Iraqis was a brutal one. They weren't in a tank battle. They were inside a computer-simulated execution. The Americans had successfully decoupled warfare from weather. For the first time in history, the environment didn't matter. The time of day didn't matter. The quality of the map didn't matter. Only the signal mattered. As Eagle Troop smashed through the 73 easting, they didn't just break the Iraqi line. They broke the Iraqi psyche. The survivors fled into the dust, screaming about the invisible death. They had been told the desert was their ally. They had been told the sand would protect them from the Westerners. But as the burning husks of their elite T-72s lit up the Iraqi night, they realized that the Americans hadn't just brought a bigger hammer. They had brought a system that turned the entire planet into a target. While the burning turret of a T-72 at 73 easting was the most visceral evidence of American superiority, it was only the tip of a much larger, more terrifying iceberg. The real systemic dominance wasn't found in a single tank battle, it was found in the thousands of unglamorous supply trucks, fuel tankers, and medical Humvees that followed the armor into the void. You see, most people think of military power as the ability to destroy. But the true measure of a superpower is the ability to sustain. In any previous war, a logistical tail that stretched 300 miles into a featureless desert would have been a death sentence. The supply lines would have splintered. Drivers would have taken the wrong turn at a non-existent junction. Fuel would have arrived at the wrong coordinates, and the left hook would have run out of gas before it reached the Republican Guard. The Iraqis had counted on this. They knew that Western armies were heavy and required constant nourishment. They expected the American hook to tangle itself in its own logistics. But they had failed to account for the American industrial edge, the ability to turn a niche, high-tech experiment into a universal standard in a matter of weeks. By the time the ground war was in full swing, the U.S. had managed to distribute thousands of GPS receivers across every branch of the service. It wasn't just the elite cavalry, it was the sergeant driving a truck full of spare parts. It was the medevac pilot flying through a dust storm to find a wounded soldier. It was the B-52 Navigator dropping a payload from 40,000 feet. This leads to the great teaching pause of the 1990s. Germany built tanks for duels. The Soviets built tanks for mass. But America built a system for integration. Contrast that for a moment. An Iraqi tank was a standalone weapon. If it lost contact with its commander, it was a blind box of steel. An American tank was a node in a global network. It was connected to the heavens, to the air support above, and to the sea of logistics behind it. GPS was the connective tissue that made this integration possible. It allowed the Americans to act as a single, massive, coordinated organism rather than a collection of individual units. The scale of this dominance was something the world had never seen. At the peak of the operation, the U.S. military was managing a moving map that encompassed the entire Kuwaiti theater of operations. Every commander, from General Schwarzkopf in his Riyadh headquarters to a corporal in a foxhole, was looking at the same digital reality. They weren't fighting over a hill or a valley anymore. They were fighting over global coordinates. This took the traditional fog of war and replaced it with a God's eye view. The American strategic edge was also rooted in a uniquely American brand of optimism, the kind that spends billions of dollars on a space clock. During a time of peace, just because a few engineers believed it was possible. While other nations were focusing on the immediate needs of their borders, the United States was looking at the orbital planes. They were building a global presence that wasn't just about placing boots on the ground, but about placing a perpetual, invisible infrastructure in the sky. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed and the Gulf War ended, the world realized that the American century wasn't just about manufacturing, it was about positioning. You see, the truth was that the U.S. had achieved something even more significant than a battlefield victory. They had military industrialized the very concept of where. They had turned the entire planet into a pre-grid target range. Whether you were in a jungle in Southeast Asia, a mountain range in the Balkans, or a featureless desert in Iraq, the American military knew where you were to within 3 meters. And more importantly, they knew exactly where they were. This wasn't just superiority, it was a paradigm shift. It was the moment that precision replaced volume as the currency of war. One GPS-guided cruise missile was now more effective than 1,000 gravity bombs. One coordinated armored division was more lethal than 10 disorganized ones. The United States didn't just have more power, they had better geometry. They had conquered the map by creating a new one that didn't rely on landmarks or memories, but on the relentless, unblinking precision of 24 satellites that never slept, never got lost, and never lied. The Iraqi army, which had entered the war as one of the most respected forces in the world, was systematically dismantled by this geometry. They were fighting a 2D war on a 3D coordinate system. And as the smoke cleared over the highway of death, the rest of the world watched in awe. They weren't just seeing a military victory, they were seeing the birth of the digital age on the battlefield. The era of the featureless desert was over. From now on, there was no place left on Earth to hide. In the decades following the smoke of 1991, the world changed in ways the architects of Navstar could never have fully predicted. The technology that had once been used to guide a 68-ton Abrams through a lethal sandstorm was eventually released to the public, finding its way into the pocket of every human being on the planet. Today, we use it to find the nearest coffee shop or to track a delivery truck, forgetting that its first true customer was a tank commander charging into a void to liberate a country. We have lived in the age of the blue dot for so long that we have forgotten what it feels like to be truly lost. But for the men who were there, men like H.R. McMaster and the thousands of veterans who watched their slugger screens in the dark, the legacy of GPS isn't about convenience. It's about the awesome, terrifying power of American ingenuity when it is focused on a singular goal. It serves as a reminder that the greatest weapon in the American arsenal has never been our steel, our fire, or our numbers. It has always been our refusal to accept the impossible as a final answer. They said you couldn't navigate the trackless desert at night. We built a system that made the desert irrelevant. They said you couldn't hit a target you couldn't see. We taught our missiles how to think in 3 dimensions. They said that in the empty quarter, the sand would always be the master. We proved that even the dunes of Iraq are subject to the laws of American physics. You see, there is a deep philosophical truth buried in the history of that desert storm. Most empires are built on the control of land, but the American empire was built on the mastery of the unseen. We didn't just conquer the territory, we conquered the very concept of the unknown. We transformed the ancient, terrifying mystery of the horizon into a set of predictable, manageable numbers. And in doing so, we changed the nature of human freedom. Because to be free, you must first know where you stand. As the years pass, the rusting hulks of the T-72s at 73 Easting are slowly being swallowed by the dunes. The desert is doing what it has always done, erasing the marks of men, smoothing over the scars of battle, and reclaiming its featureless,
silent domain.
But if you look up on a clear night, far away from the city lights, you can still see them, the man-made stars moving in their perfect, orchestrated orbits. They are still there, whispering their silent messages of time and place to a world that has largely forgotten why they were put there in the first place. They brought the myth of the impassable sand. We brought the math of the celestial clock. In the quiet after the last engine was cut and the last signal was received, a new truth remained etched across the map of history. The desert had not failed the Iraqis, their imagination had. They had built their defenses around the idea that some places were beyond the reach of human certainty. They forgot that when America looks at a wall, we don't see a barrier.
We see a challenge.
And when we look at a featureless void, we don't see a place to get lost. We see a blank page, waiting for us to write the coordinates of our next victory.
It wasn't luck.
It was physics, precision, and 300 million people who refused to lose. And that was the night the American century signed its name across the sky, in exhaust trails and empty radar screens.